What is up, guys? Parker Gurney here. We are here in historic Lehigh in the Commerce District, and today we're going to talk about camera parts and camera operation. Cue the intro. Okay, so we are using the audio from the iPhone right now, okay? It's facing forward. This is the best way to pull out the camera and kind of show you guys the parts of the camera and how it all operates. Okay, so the first thing we're going to look at is the camera body. This right here represents the body of the camera. The body of the camera is essentially all the components of the camera comprised into the chassis. Holds all the components comprising the sensor and all the other electronics, okay? Next thing we're going to go over is the camera sensor, okay? Now this guy right here, you can see it's got some different color, different coatings on it. That is the sensor of the camera. The sensor's job is to take the light that comes through the lens and projects onto the sensor, taking that projection and translating it into a digital file, okay, which you then can go and use on your editing software, okay? You got the body, you got the sensor, and you got your lens, okay? The lens's job is to control the amount of light passing through with its aperture, okay, and then project the image onto the sensor. That is all the lens does. So those are the parts of the camera. It's super simple. The thing that we use every day to create our masterpieces and our works of art, those are the basic parts of this guy right here, which helps us create. Next thing we're going to talk about is the lighting triangle. It's the three things which you can adjust on your camera to adjust for the brightness and the exposure. Shutter speed will be the first thing that we talk about. Shutter speed and shutter isn't actually a part of the lens. The shutter is actually a part of the camera. The shutter is a mechanism that opens and closes to adjust for how much light passes through, and it also has an effect with how your camera captures motion, okay? And we'll demonstrate that here in just a minute. The second part is aperture. The aperture is a mechanism in your lens which opens and closes to create an opening in which that light passes through. Think of it as your iris in your eye, okay? Your eye has its iris that opens and closes. It's the colored part of your eye. The pupil's the hole. As that iris opens up, that pupil gets bigger and more light passes through. The iris closes, it's got a smaller opening, less light passes through. And so the aperture and the shutter speed are the two biggest and most important changes to make to adjust for your brightness and exposure. The last thing you can change is ISO, which is actually a digital change that your camera can make to digitally enhance the image, okay? So it creates noise and some other artifacts that actually aren't great, and so your ISO is going to be your last resort, okay? So that's why when you're looking at the triangle, I draw it with your aperture and shutter speed at the top and your shutter speed down below. So it creates the two most important at the top, ISO at the bottom, which is not less important. That is your last resort for changes to make. So right now I'm going to go ahead and shoot the traffic of the cars going by. I'm first going to adjust the shutter speed, and I'll label the shutter speed on each one and allow you to see the difference that the shutter speed makes in motion as well as in lighting and different particular objects in the shot. Okay, so as you can see, the higher the shutter speed, the darker the image is going to get in certain areas of the image. But the motion of the cars is a lot smoother and you get more information there. There's less of a blur and it's a lot smoother. One rule of thumb you definitely need to be aware of when you're working with shutter speed and frames per second. Whatever the setting of whatever your frames per second setting is, you need to be sure that your frame or your shutter speed never goes below double what your frame rate is. And what this will do is it'll actually create a ghosting effect in your image. you'll see that the motion behind it, there'll be a drastic motion blur because your frame rate or your shutter speed is not in sync with your frame rate. As you can see, there's a lag in the image. The whatever motion is happening, it kind of falls behind and drags out that across your image. So you always want to stay double your shutter speed of your frame rate. Next thing we're talking about is aperture. Okay, now aperture has a correlation with focus and depth of field. Okay, your aperture, like I said, is your iris that opens and closes and adjusts for how much light passes through the lens and projects onto the sensor. Lower the aperture number, bigger the opening of the iris. Okay, bigger the aperture number, actually smaller the opening of the iris. It's kind of a little bit backwards thinking, but it is what it is. Smaller the aperture, so bigger the opening, you actually have an opportunity to create a larger depth of field, which is the ability to have selective focus. What I mean by selective focus is you can get very particular about what's in focus in your shot and focal distance. In these shots, I didn't change anything with the focus of the lens. Only thing I changed was the aperture. I just closed the aperture ever so slightly each shot. Okay, started with a 2.8. Okay, next was about a 5. Okay, last one was a 16. Again, didn't change anything with the lens, but as you can see, the depth of field was actually increased, meaning that the depth of field of the first one was just selected on that first pillar. The depth of field then increased with the f.5 or f5 up to almost to the building, and then with an f16, the depth of field then increased all the way down the street. Okay, so smaller the opening, the greater the depth of field and the greater the ability to have lots of things in focus. So that is the basics of cameras. Okay, we talked about the parts of the camera, we went over the body, we went over the sensor, and we went over the lens. Okay, with operation of the camera, we talked about shutter speed, talked about ISO, and we talked about aperture. We also talked about the correlation of shutter speed with frames per second, and the correlation between aperture and focus. Okay, with these basic principles, you are now equipped to handle your camera and operate it to get some great footage, and I hope you the best in doing so. Remember, get out there and create, be creative, always be creating. The more that you're out creating, the better you're going to become as a filmmaker. This is Parker Gurney signing off.